The Beggar and the Stray. Dean sat on his usual spot, a worn corner of the city square that had become his makeshift home. His clothes were tattered, his hands rough and calloused from years of hardship. People hurried by him, casting quick glances his way, some dropping coins or food, others ignoring him entirely. But Dean had grown used to it. He wasn't bitter. Instead, he always greeted people with a nod, sometimes even a smile. And if someone gave him something, he never failed to say, "Thank you," with genuine warmth. Dean was in his early 40s, but hardship had aged him beyond his years. Once, he had been a promising young man with dreams and aspirations. He had come from a small town, brimming with ideas about how he'd change the world. Though he never completed college, he pursued what he was passionate about, building something of his own. In his mid-20s, he had started a small business, something he poured his heart and soul into. For a time, it seemed as if the world was on his side. His business thrived, giving him a sense of purpose and a means to support himself. But life had other plans. A few years later, due to circumstances beyond his control, an economic downturn, a betrayal by a trusted partner, a personal illness that drained his finances, his business collapsed. He tried to pick up the pieces to start over, but every attempt seemed cursed. Eventually, he lost everything. His savings were gone, and his debts mounted. With no family left to turn to and nowhere else to go, Dean found himself on the streets. Despite everything, Dean remained kind-hearted. Unlike some other beggars who had grown bitter and guarded, Dean held on to a quiet dignity. He knew that everyone had their own struggles, and he didn't feel entitled to anyone's pity. He accepted kindness with gratitude and tried to make do with the little he had. It was during this difficult time that Dean met Scott, a scruffy, gray-furred stray dog with one ear slightly bent and a pair of soulful eyes. Scott's appearance wasn't glamorous. In fact, he looked as worn and weathered as Dean himself. The first time they crossed paths, Dean was having a meager lunch, a sandwich someone had kindly given him earlier in the day. He noticed Scott lurking nearby, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The dog's ribs were visible through his thin coat, a silent testimony to the life of hunger and hardship he had endured. At first, Scott kept his distance, eyeing Dean's sandwich with a mix of hope and caution. Dean noticed the dog, and feeling a pang of empathy, tore a piece of his sandwich and placed it on the ground a few feet away. "Here you go, buddy," Dean said softly, trying not to startle the animal. "It's not much, but it's something." Scott hesitated, his eyes darting between Dean and the food, as though trying to decide if he could trust this strange human. After a moment, he cautiously approached, sniffing the morsel before gulping it down quickly. Dean smiled, watching as the dog finished the food and glanced up at him, as if to say thank you. Over the next few days, Scott returned. Each time, he was a little less wary, a little more willing to come closer. Dean made it a habit to save a small portion of whatever he was given each day, setting it aside for his new companion. He knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to wander through life feeling invisible. Scott was no different, just another lost soul in a world that didn't seem to care. It wasn't long before Scott began to follow Dean around, staying near him as he went about his daily routines. Dean grew fond of the scruffy dog, and the two of them developed a quiet companionship. Sometimes, people passing by would see Dean cradling Scott in his lap, wrapping him in a worn blanket for warmth. To the passers-by, it was an odd sight, a homeless man cradling a stray dog as if he were a child. One rainy afternoon, Dean sat huddled under a narrow overhang, trying to shield himself from the cold drizzle. Scott was curled up beside him, his fur damp but his spirit unbroken. As Dean sat there, shivering, a woman approached, glancing down at the sight of the man and his dog. "Here," she said, handing him a warm cup of coffee and a sandwich. "For you and your friend here." Dean smiled gratefully, his hands trembling as he accepted the warm drink. "Thank you, ma'am. This means a lot." She nodded, looking down at Scott. "Is he your dog?" she asked, curiosity lacing her voice. Dean chuckled, shaking his head. "Not really. Scott here just showed up one day, hungry and looking for a friend. I guess you could say we found each other." The woman's face softened. "Well, it's nice to see someone who cares. Most people just shoo them away." Dean looked down at Scott, who was now licking his paw contentedly. "We all need someone, even if it's just a scruffy old dog like this. He's been there for me more than most people." The woman lingered for a moment before walking away, casting one last glance at the unlikely pair. Dean had no idea that their small act of kindness, a homeless man caring for a stray dog, would become a spectacle in the neighborhood. Soon, people began to recognize Dean, not just as another face on the street, but as the man with the dog. And then something surprising happened. Scott, it seemed, was a bit of a social butterfly among the stray dogs in the area. Not long after he began spending his days with Dean, other dogs started appearing. At first it was just one or two, drawn by the scent of food or perhaps by Scott's unspoken recommendation. But as time passed, more strays began to join them. By the end of the month, Dean found himself surrounded by a small pack of loyal dogs, all of them seemingly content to stay by his side. People began to notice the growing number of dogs around Dean. Curious onlookers would stop to watch as he handed out small portions of food, carefully rationing his meager supply so that each dog received a bit of sustenance. Dean didn't have much, but what he had, he shared willingly. Despite his difficult circumstances, Dean treated each dog with gentle kindness, calling them by names he had given them: Rusty, Bella, Max, Luma. Each dog had its own personality, its own quirks, and Dean knew them all. He had created his own little family on the streets, bound not by blood but by need and loyalty. Word of the beggar with the dogs began to spread, and people would stop by just to see the spectacle. Some were curious, others confused, and a few were even moved. What kind of man, they'd wondered, would choose to share his meager resources with a bunch of stray dogs when he could barely feed himself? But for Dean, it wasn't a question. The dogs had given him a purpose, a reason to wake up each day, despite his circumstances. They trusted him, and he would never betray that trust. As the days turned into weeks, the pack of dogs became an inseparable part of Dean's life. They followed him everywhere, flanking him like loyal soldiers. People would see him strolling down the street, a line of dogs trailing behind, their tails wagging in unison. To the people of the neighborhood, it was an unusual sight, one that filled them with a strange sense of warmth and curiosity. One day, as Dean sat in his usual spot, a young woman approached him, her face a mixture of curiosity and kindness. She had noticed him for weeks, always with his entourage of dogs, and today she had decided to find out why. "Excuse me," she said gently, crouching down to meet his gaze. "I've seen you here with all these dogs, every single day. Why do they come to you?" Dean looked at her, surprised by her interest. He hesitated, glancing at the dogs around him, and then back at her. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, but filled with a quiet pride. "They come because they know I care," he replied simply. "In a world where most people just walk by, these little guys, they see me, and I see them. We're all strays in our own way, I guess." The woman looked at him, her heart touched by the simplicity of his answer. She hadn't expected to find such depth in a man whom most people ignored. As she left, she couldn't shake the image of Dean and his dogs from her mind. Little did she know that one conversation would be the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would soon touch the hearts of people far beyond the boundaries of their small neighborhood. Dean's growing family. The next morning, Dean awoke to the familiar sight of Scott, curled up at his side on the worn blanket he used as a bed. A faint smile crept onto Dean's face as he stroked the dog's scruffy fur, his fingers tracing over the scars and dirt that told the story of Scott's rough life on the streets. Despite everything, Scott remained loyal, a quiet companion who asked for nothing and gave everything. Over the weeks, Scott's visits had become more than routine. He was Dean's first true friend since his life had taken its downward spiral. And now, other dogs seemed to have taken notice of the bond between Dean and Scott. It started with a skinny brown mutt with big, sorrowful eyes, followed by a limping terrier, then an elderly golden retriever with patches of fur missing. Each dog approached Dean cautiously, as if sensing that he was someone who would not turn them away. Dean's days settled into a strange but comforting rhythm. He would sit in his spot near the city square, with his small group of dogs sprawled around him. Sometimes, people would stop to stare, intrigued by the unusual sight of a beggar surrounded by a growing pack of strays. Dean noticed the looks, the whispers, but he didn't mind. He was used to being seen as an oddity, and if his companionship with the dogs brought a little light into someone's day, that was enough for him. Every day, Dean's humble offerings were divided among his furry friends. When someone gave him a sandwich, he would break it into pieces, making sure each dog got a share. If he received a few coins, he would visit the nearest store to buy dog food, making every cent count. It didn't matter to him if it meant he would go hungry. The dogs were his family now, and he would never let them feel unwanted or unloved. One chilly afternoon, as Dean handed out his usual rations, he noticed a young pup, barely a few months old, hiding behind a trash can across the street. The little dog's fur was matted, and its eyes were filled with a fearful curiosity. Dean held out a small piece of bread, his hand steady and inviting. The pup hesitated, inching forward slowly, its tiny body trembling with both hunger and caution. "Come on, little one," Dean coaxed, his voice gentle. "I won't hurt you." Scott, ever the ambassador, wagged his tail and gave a soft bark, as if encouraging the newcomer to join them. The pup seemed to take comfort in Scott's presence, and after a few moments, it finally trotted over, its tiny paws patting on the cold pavement. Dean held out the bread, watching as the pup sniffed it before taking a cautious bite. The others watched, their tails wagging in quiet approval, as if welcoming a new member into their pack. As the days passed, Dean's family continued to grow. The pup, whom he named Peanut, became a regular visitor, curling up next to Scott whenever Dean settled down for the night. Then came Rusty, a scrappy terrier mix with a distinctive scar across his snout. Rusty was wary at first, but after seeing how Dean treated the others, he, too, joined the fold. It wasn't long before Dean found himself surrounded by nearly a dozen strays, each with their own story, their own scars, both visible and hidden. There was Luna, the timid black lab who had likely been abandoned, and Bella, a sleek, graceful greyhound who had once been someone's pet, but now wore the gaunt look of starvation. Each dog brought its own energy, its own quirks, and Dean cherished them all. They were broken, just like him, but together they created something whole, something that felt like family. Dean noticed that people had started to recognize him, not just as a homeless man, but as the guy with the dogs. Children would tug on their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly at Dean's growing pack as they walked by. Occasionally, someone would stop and offer him a bag of dog food or an extra sandwich, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. One day, a teenager approached Dean, a hesitant smile on his face. He held out a small, unopened bag of treats, his hand trembling slightly as if unsure of how his gesture would be received. For the dogs," he stammered, his cheeks flushing. Dean took the bag with a grateful smile. "Thank you, son. They'll appreciate this." The boy lingered, watching as Dean opened the bag and handed out treats to each dog, their tails wagging in joyful anticipation. Dean saw the wonder in the boy's eyes, the fascination as he watched a group of animals who had once roamed the streets alone, now united under the care of a man society had all but forgotten. You really care about them, don't you?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dean nodded, looking down at his furry companions. "They're my friends. When you've lost everything, you learn to cherish the simple things. These guys, they remind me that I still have something to give." The boy's eyes softened, and he nodded before hurrying away, leaving Dean with a small, bittersweet smile. Moments like these reminded him that kindness still existed, that even in his darkest days, there were glimmers of humanity to be found. As the days turned into weeks, Dean's connection with the dogs became a spectacle that could not go unnoticed. Local residents began to refer to him as the Stray Whisperer, marveling at the way the dogs gathered around him, as if he were their shepherd. Some people were moved by the sight, while others were puzzled, even wary. A few would mutter under their breaths about that crazy man with all those dogs, but Dean didn't pay them any mind. His focus remained on his furry family, on making sure they felt safe and loved. One afternoon, as Dean sat with his pack around him, an elderly man approached, his face creased with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "Why do they come to you?" the man asked, his voice gentle but inquisitive. "Why so many?" Dean looked up, meeting the man's gaze with quiet humility. "I don't know," he replied softly. "Maybe they sense that I understand what it's like to feel alone, to feel forgotten." The elderly man nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. He reached into his pocket and handed Dean a crisp bill, more than Dean had seen in weeks. "Take care of them," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "And take care of yourself, too." Dean thanked him, tucking the money away, grateful not only for the financial help, but for the compassion behind it. He used part of it to buy dog food, and the rest to get a warm meal, sharing bites with Scott and the others. Every meal was a communal experience now, a small celebration of the life they shared. As the bond between Dean and his dogs deepened, so did the sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. He had lost everything once: his business, his home, his place in society. But in caring for these stray animals, he felt a spark of meaning rekindling within him. Each wagging tail, each trusting gaze reminded him that he still had worth, that he could still make a difference, even if it was in a small, unconventional way. One night, as Dean lay on his blanket with Scott curled up beside him, he looked up at the stars, feeling a rare sense of peace. He realized that, in a strange way, his life had come full circle. He had once been surrounded by people, driven by ambition and success, but it was only now, lying under the stars with a family of strays, that he felt truly at home. The following morning, as he began his day, Dean noticed a few new dogs lingering nearby, watching him with curious eyes. He sighed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Looks like we got more company, Scott," he murmured, scratching the dog behind the ears. Scott wagged his tail, as if to say he was ready to welcome more friends into their growing family. Dean chuckled, feeling the weight of his hardships lift, if only for a moment. His family might be unconventional, his circumstances dire, but he knew that as long as he had his dogs by his side, he could face whatever challenges came his way. Little did he know, the bond he had forged with these dogs was about to touch the hearts of people far beyond his small corner of the world. And as more people stopped to watch, curious about the man with the strays, Dean's story of resilience and compassion began to ripple outwards, planting seeds of hope and kindness that would soon blossom in ways he could never have imagined. The curious stranger. As Dean's family of dogs continued to grow, so did the curiosity of the neighborhood. The sight of a homeless man surrounded by a loyal pack of strays had become a daily spectacle, something of a mystery that people couldn't quite understand. Day after day, people would walk by, some with mild interest, others with open fascination. Parents would point him out to their children, murmuring about the dog man, and groups of friends would stop to snap pictures, whispering to each other about the unlikely scene. But Dean hardly noticed them. His days were filled with the simple yet profound task of caring for his furry companions. He spent his mornings gathering food, either from donations or whatever little he could purchase, and his afternoons playing with the dogs, calling each one by name, giving them a sense of identity and belonging. For most of the world, These were just stray dogs, but to Dean, they were family. They were creatures who, like him, had been cast aside, yet who had chosen love over bitterness. One brisk autumn afternoon, Dean was feeding the dogs bits of bread when a young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder approached him. She looked to be in her late 20s, with a face framed by loose curls and a gentle, curious expression. She had been watching Dean for days, observing the way he interacted with the dogs, the way they seemed to orbit him like planets around a sun. There was something about this man, something kind and genuine, that intrigued her. And today, she had mustered the courage to find out more. "Excuse me," she said softly, crouching down so that she was at eye level with him. Dean looked up, a little startled but smiling politely. "Yes," he replied, his voice warm despite his apparent exhaustion. The woman glanced at the dogs, who were watching her with varying degrees of interest. Scott, ever the guardian, stepped a bit closer to Dean, his eyes fixed on the stranger, while Peanut and Rusty sniffed the air curiously. "I've seen you here almost every day," she began, "and I couldn't help but notice how many dogs you have around you. They seem so happy, so connected to you. It's unusual to see something like this. Do they all belong to you?" Dean chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. They don't belong to me. I think, in a way, I belong to them." She tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Dean glanced around at the dogs, a soft smile playing on his lips as he gestured to them. "These guys, they've all been left behind in some way. Just like me. They found me, and I couldn't turn them away. They give me purpose, a reason to get up every morning, you know." The woman's eyes softened, and she seemed genuinely touched by his words. You must really care for them." Dean nodded, his gaze drifting over his pack. "I do. Each one of them has their own story, their own scars. I know what that feels like. So I do what I can to make sure they don't feel alone." She was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. Then, as if realizing she hadn't introduced herself, she extended a hand. "I'm Clara, by the way." Dean shook her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. Dean, would you mind if I took a few pictures? I'm a photographer, and, well, there's something beautiful about what you're doing here. I think people should see it." Dean hesitated, glancing down at the dogs, then back at her. He wasn't sure why anyone would want to take pictures of him, but Clara's expression was kind and sincere. After a moment, he nodded. "Sure, if you think it'll help people understand." Clara smiled gratefully, lifting her camera. She snapped a few shots of Dean sitting cross-legged on the ground, his pack gathered around him. She captured the tenderness in his eyes as he fed Scott a small treat, the way Rusty nudged his hand for attention, the way Peanut leaned against his leg with quiet contentment. Through her lens, she saw not just a homeless man with a group of dogs, but a man whose heart had room for every lost soul, human or animal. As she continued taking pictures, Clara found herself drawn deeper into Dean's world. She asked him about his past, and feeling an unexpected trust in her, Dean shared bits and pieces of his story, his dreams of running a small business, the failures that had crushed him, the loneliness that had followed. He didn't go into detail, but Clara could sense the pain in his words, the quiet resilience that kept him moving forward. "They must bring you a lot of joy," she commented, watching as Luna, the timid black lad, sidled up to Dean for a scratch behind the ears. "They do," he replied softly. "I guess we're all just trying to find a bit of peace in this world." Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. There was a raw honesty in Dean's voice that made her realize just how much he had lost. Yet here he was, choosing compassion over bitterness. It was a story that needed to be told, she decided, one that went beyond the surface-level curiosity people felt when they saw him on the street. "Dean," she said hesitantly, lowering her camera, "would you mind if I shared your story? I have a following on social media, and I think I think people need to hear about what you're doing here." Dean looked at her, a little taken aback. "You really think anyone would care about a man and his dogs?" Clara nodded firmly. "Yes, I do. People need reminders that kindness still exists, that there are people out there who care even when they have little to give." You're inspiring, Dean." He looked down, a touch of humility softening his expression. "If you think it'll help others see these dogs differently, then, sure, go ahead." With his permission, Clara spent the next hour documenting Dean's interactions with the dogs, capturing moments of tenderness, moments of laughter. She listened as he told her each dog's story, their names, the unique ways they had found their way into his life. Scott, of course, was his first friend, the dog who had broken through his walls when he'd been at his lowest. Then there was Bella, the elegant greyhound who had once been someone's beloved pet, but was now a stray. And Peanut, the smallest of the pack, whom Dean had taken under his wing as if he were his own child. As Clara prepared to leave, she promised Dean that she would share his story with respect and care. He nodded, offering her a grateful smile, though he couldn't fully grasp why she seemed so moved by his life. That evening, Clara went home and began writing, pouring her emotions into the story of Dean and his family of strays. She uploaded the photos she had taken, each one a testament to the quiet love and loyalty Dean had inspired in his dogs. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She simply let his kindness speak for itself. When she posted the story on her social media accounts, she never expected the reaction that followed. Within hours, the story began to spread, shared by hundreds, then thousands of people who were moved by Dean's compassion. Comments poured in from around the world, people expressing admiration for his selflessness, others sharing stories of their own experiences with strays and rescues. The internet had fallen in love with Dean and his pack, captivated by the image of a man who had little, yet gave everything he had to those who needed it most. The next morning, Dean sat in his usual spot, unaware of the waves his story was making online. People approached him more often than usual, some handing him food or money, others simply stopping to thank him for his kindness. Confused by the sudden attention, Dean looked to Clara for an explanation when she stopped by to check on him later that day. Did you tell people about me?" he asked, feeling both flattered and overwhelmed. Clara smiled, a twinkle in her eye. "I did, and they loved it. You've touched a lot of hearts, Dean. People all over the world know about you and your dogs now." Dean blinked, stunned. He had never imagined that his simple life with the dogs could mean anything to anyone else. To him, it was just survival, an attempt to hold on to something good amidst the darkness. "Why would they care?" he murmured, almost to himself. Clara's smile softened. "Because, Dean, you remind people that there's still kindness in this world, that even in the toughest times, we can choose to be good. People need that reminder more than you realize." Dean felt a lump in his throat, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. For so long, he had been invisible, forgotten. But now, because of Clara's kindness, he had become a symbol of resilience and compassion, a reminder of the power of love. As he sat there, surrounded by his loyal pack, he realized that his story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who believed in kindness, in the strength of the human spirit. And with that realization came a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, Dean felt seen. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't just a beggar on the street. He was a man who had found his family in the unlikeliest of places, and now the world was watching. A new kind of hope. Days turned into weeks, and Dean's life began to change in ways he had never anticipated. Ever since Clara had shared his story online, he noticed an outpouring of kindness from strangers. People who had never spoken to him before were now stopping by, some with bags of dog food, others with blankets, clothes, and even little treats for the dogs. For the first time in years, Dean felt a sense of security, a knowledge that he and his dogs would be looked after, even if just for a while. One cold morning, as Dean settled into his usual spot with Scott at his side, a crowd began to gather around him, more people than he had ever seen before. They looked at him with warmth, some even teary-eyed, as if they knew him personally. It was still strange for Dean, this sudden interest in his life. He had spent so long feeling invisible, just another face in the city. And now, people knew his name, his story. An older woman approached him, holding a warm fleece blanket. "For you, dear," she said gently, wrapping it around his shoulders. Dean looked up, taken aback by the gesture. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She patted his shoulder, a soft smile on her face. "No need to thank me, son. You've given us all a reminder of what's important. You're doing something beautiful here." Dean nodded, a little overwhelmed. He wasn't sure how to respond to such kindness, especially when it felt so foreign. The truth was, he hadn't set out to inspire anyone. All he had done was care for the dogs because he understood what it meant to be abandoned, to feel unworthy. But now, seeing how people reacted, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a purpose beyond mere survival. As the morning wore on, more people stopped by. A family with 2 young children brought him a basket filled with fruits and bread. A group of teenagers left a big bag of dog treats at his feet, then walked away with wide smiles, as though they had just done something extraordinary. Dean watched, grateful but bewildered, and tried his best to thank each person, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. The dogs, too, seemed to sense the shift. Scott, ever the loyal companion, stayed close to Dean's side, while Peanut yapped excitedly at the sight of new people. Bella, the graceful greyhound, wagged her tail as strangers petted her gently. The other dogs milled around, basking in the attention they had never known before. And then, in the middle of this outpouring of generosity, Clara arrived. She had been following the response to Dean's story closely, touched by the impact it had made. She watched from a distance, her heart swelling as she saw the man she had come to admire, now surrounded by a community that had once overlooked him. After a while, she made her way over to him, her eyes shining with pride. "Clara," Dean said, smiling as she approached, This is all because of you." Clara shook her head, laughing softly. "No, Dean. This is because of you. People just needed to see what you were doing. You showed them that even when life is hard, we can still choose kindness." He looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I never thought anyone would care about a man like me. I was just trying to do some good with what little I had left." Clara sat down beside him, resting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That's exactly why they care. You didn't have much, but you gave it all anyway. That kind of selflessness, it's rare. People see it, and it reminds them of the good they can do too." Dean nodded, his heart full. For so long, he had been caught in a spiral of loss and despair, haunted by the life he had once known. But now, in this unexpected new chapter, he felt a glimmer of hope, a light that guided him out of the darkness. Perhaps, he thought, his life still held meaning, even if it wasn't the life he had once envisioned. In the days that followed, Dean's story continued to spread, reaching people far beyond his neighborhood. Donations poured in, from dog food and blankets to monetary gifts, left discreetly with notes that read, "For Dean and his family." Each act of kindness left him humbled, and each day he grew more determined to honor the support he was receiving by continuing to care for his dogs, ensuring they never felt the cold sting of abandonment he knew too well. Then one afternoon, as he sat with his dogs in their usual spot, a tall man in a neatly pressed suit approached him. Dean noticed the man immediately. He didn't blend in with the usual crowd of passersby. His sharp suit and polished shoes made him stand out, and he carried himself with an air of authority that Dean found both intimidating and intriguing. "Are you Dean?" the man asked, his voice smooth but direct. Dean nodded, a little wary. "Yes, sir. That's me." The man extended his hand. "My name is Michael Hayes. I'm the director of a local animal shelter. I heard about you and your unique family here. I wanted to come by personally to see if there's anything we can do to help." Dean shook his hand, his mind racing. He had always known about the shelters in the city, but his relationship with the dogs was different. They were more than just strays to him. They were family. And the thought of them being taken away, put in cages, filled him with dread. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," he replied carefully. "But these dogs, they mean everything to me. I don't think I could bear to part with them." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, Dean. I'm not here to take them from you. In fact, I came to offer a different kind of support." Dean tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" Michael took a seat on the bench beside him, glancing at the dogs with a soft smile. "We have resources, food, medical supplies, even blankets and beds. I'd like to offer those to you, to help you continue caring for these dogs the way you have. And if any of them ever need medical attention, our shelter can provide that as well." Dean's eyes widened, a surge of relief washing over him. You would do that?" Michael nodded, his gaze kind. "Yes, it's the least we can do. I've never seen anything quite like this, Dean. You've created something beautiful here, something that goes beyond just helping a few strays. You've shown these animals love when the world turned its back on them. That's worth supporting." Dean looked down, his heart brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to thank you enough." Michael smiled, clapping Dean on the shoulder. "Just keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." With the shelter's support, Dean's life took on a new rhythm. Every week, someone from the shelter would drop off supplies. Bags of dog food, blankets, and medical kits. They even brought a few foldable kennels, not to cage the dogs, but to give them a place to rest when the nights grew cold. The dogs adapted quickly, curling up in the soft blankets with looks of pure contentment, their eyes reflecting a sense of security that Dean had never seen before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dean looked around at his makeshift family, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. Scott was curled up beside him, his ever-loyal companion, while Peanut snoozed in one of the new kennels, his tiny paws twitching in a dream. Bella stretched out on her side, sighing contentedly, while Rusty and Luna lay close by, their heads resting on each other. For the first time in years, Dean felt like he belonged. He was no longer just a nameless man on the streets. He was Dean, the man who loved the dogs, the man who had brought together a pack of broken souls and given them a reason to trust again. And because of him, people had remembered that kindness, even in its simplest forms, could change lives. As he gazed at the stars above, Dean thought about the journey that had brought him here, to this unlikely place of acceptance and love. He remembered the life he had lost, the pain that had once defined him. But now, surrounded by his dogs, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found something greater. The next morning, Clara returned, carrying a small notebook and a pen. She approached Dean with a bright smile, her eyes filled with excitement. "Dean, I've been thinking," she began. "What if we did something bigger with your story? I've had so many people reaching out, asking how they can help. Maybe we could start a fund to support you and the dogs, something sustainable that could provide for you both long-term." Dean hesitated, the idea both thrilling and intimidating. He wasn't used to asking for help, to relying on others. But as he looked at Clara, at the sincerity in her eyes, he felt a spark of hope. "You think people would really want to do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Clara nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. You've touched so many hearts, Dean. People want to help, to be part of something meaningful. This isn't just about the dogs. It's about you and the kindness you've shown, even when life gave you every reason to give up." Dean swallowed hard, his heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For so long, he had thought of himself as someone who had failed, who had lost everything. But now he realized that he had found something greater than success, something that could never be measured in wealth or status. With Clara's encouragement, they set up a modest online fundraiser, sharing Dean's story with people around the world. And as the donations began to pour in, Dean felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, a knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Dean and his dogs had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could be found. And as he held Scott close, watching as people continued to offer their kindness, Dean knew that he had found a new kind of family, one that extended far beyond the streets he had once called home. The community rallies. The days after the fundraiser launch were nothing short of surreal for Dean. Clara had done an incredible job crafting his story, sharing photos and moments that captured the quiet resilience and love that bound him and his dogs together. Each day, Dean watched in amazement as donations poured in, accompanied by messages of support from people around the world. Some donors sent heartfelt notes, others shared their own stories of resilience, and some simply thanked him for showing them the power of kindness. The donations weren't just money. They were a lifeline, a beacon of hope. For the first time, Dean realized he could truly provide for his dogs without fear. He wouldn't have to wonder where the next meal was coming from, or whether he'd have to stretch his last dollar to buy food for them instead of himself. With the shelter's continued support and the generosity of strangers, Dean felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: stability. But it wasn't just the donations that were changing his life. As news of his story spread, people from the local community began showing up at the city square, not only to see him but to lend a helping hand. They wanted to meet the man who had shown them that love and compassion could thrive in the unlikeliest of places. One morning, as Dean was feeding his dogs, he noticed a small crowd gathering nearby. A group of young people, probably college students, approached him with big smiles and bags filled with supplies. They introduced themselves as members of an animal welfare club at a nearby university, and they had come bearing gifts: bags of dog food, blankets, toys, and even a portable water bowl set for each dog. "We wanted to help," one of them said, her voice filled with excitement. "We've all been following your story, and we just thought, why not do something practical?" Dean looked at the supplies, his eyes welling with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to us." The students spent the morning with him, helping him organize the supplies and taking turns playing with the dogs. Peanut was especially taken with one of the students, a young man with a gentle demeanor who knelt down to scratch his belly. Peanut wriggled in delight, rolling onto his back, his tiny legs kicking the air as he basked in the attention. Scott, too, seemed to enjoy the company, circling the students with his tail wagging, occasionally nudging them with his nose for a pat on the head. The other dogs, once timid and wary of strangers, now approached with cautious curiosity, drawn by the warmth and kindness radiating from these visitors. Dean watched with a sense of pride, seeing how his dogs had grown from fearful strays into friendly, trusting companions. In the following weeks, Dean's routine continued to transform. Every few days, someone new would come by: families with their children, seniors who wanted to share stories, animal lovers with treats and blankets. Each encounter felt like a small miracle, a reminder that he was no longer alone. One afternoon, a woman named Lisa stopped by with her teenage daughters, Sophie. Lisa had been a supporter from the beginning, following Dean's story online and donating to his cause. She wanted to meet him in person, to see firsthand the impact of his kindness. When Lisa and Sophie arrived, Dean greeted them warmly, feeling an instant connection with their warm smiles and open hearts. Lisa handed him a small envelope, explaining that it was a donation from her family. Dean was deeply touched, but what truly moved him was when Sophie knelt down to meet Peanut, her face filled with a gentle understanding that went beyond her years. "You know," Sophie said, looking up at Dean, "I used to be really scared of dogs. I was bitten by one when I was little, and since then, I couldn't get over it. But after I read your story, I felt like I wanted to give them another chance." Dean smiled, watching as Sophie reached out a tentative hand, which Peanut sniffed before giving it a friendly lick. "They're good souls," Dean replied. "They just need someone to believe in them, like the rest of us." Sophie's eyes brightened, and she looked at him with newfound admiration. "Thank you, Dean. I think you've helped me too." Lisa and Sophie stayed for an hour, talking with Dean and petting the dogs, and when they finally left, Dean felt a profound sense of joy. He had not only inspired kindness in others, but he had also helped a young girl confront her fears. It was a small victory, but one that made his heart swell with pride. As time went on, the community's involvement deepened. A local bakery began donating unsold bread at the end of each day, giving Dean and his dogs a steady supply of treats. The nearby grocery store started setting aside food donations, and even the city council took notice, sending a representative to speak with Dean about how they could support his efforts. The councilman, a man named Mr. Reynolds, was moved by Dean's story. After spending some time talking to him, Mr. Reynolds proposed an idea that caught Dean completely off guard. "Dean," Mr. Reynolds said, "we've seen how much the community loves what you're doing here. We want to offer you a little space at the community center, where you and the dogs can stay out of the elements, especially during the winter months. It wouldn't be much, just a room with some bedding, but it would be a warm place to rest. And the best part, you can bring your dogs." Dean's eyes widened, his heart racing at the thought. For years, he had slept under the open sky, exposed to the cold, the rain, the merciless wind. And now he was being offered shelter, not just for himself, but for his dogs. He couldn't believe it. That would be incredible," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Reynolds. I never expected." Mr. Reynolds placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "No need to thank us, Dean. You've reminded this community of what it means to be kind, to take care of one another. This is our way of giving back." That night, Dean and his dogs moved into the small room at the community center, greeted by staff members who had gone out of their way to make the space feel welcoming. Soft bedding covered the floor, a heater hummed in the corner, and they even provided food and water bowls for each dog. Dean's heart ached with gratitude as he watched his dogs settle in, curling up on the blankets, finally able to rest without the chill of the street biting into their bones. As he lay down beside Scott, who nestled close to him, Dean gazed up at the ceiling, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. He thought about how far he had come, from a man with nothing, abandoned by society, to someone who was now embraced and uplifted by his community. He had been given a second chance, not only to survive but to thrive. In the coming weeks, the community center became more than just a shelter for Dean and his dogs. It became a gathering place for people who wanted to help. Volunteers began organizing events to raise money for animal welfare, inspired by Dean's story. Children from local schools would visit, bringing toys and treats for the dogs, their laughter filling the room as they played with Dean's furry family. Local vets offered free checkups and vaccinations for the dogs, ensuring they stayed healthy and happy. One evening, as Dean sat by the community center's fireplace with his dogs at his feet, Clara joined him, her face beaming with pride. "You've created something beautiful, Dean," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Look around you. This community has come together because of you." Dean looked around, taking in the sight of people chatting, laughing, and playing with the dogs. It was a scene he could never have imagined, a world away from the loneliness he had once known. "I never thought I'd have this," he replied quietly. "A family, a home, even if it's just for a little while." Clara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "This isn't temporary, Dean. You've changed people. You've given them a reason to care, to believe in kindness again. You belong here, and no one's going to let you go back to the streets." Dean nodded, his heart full. For so long, he had felt as though he were merely surviving, drifting through life without purpose. But now he knew that his life had meaning, that he was making a difference. As he looked down at his dogs, who lay peacefully at his feet, Dean felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had been his salvation, his reason to keep going, and now they had brought him a community that loved and supported him. He knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with gratitude and hope, surrounded by his family, both human and canine. Dean had found his place in the world, and it was a place built on love, resilience, and the simple act of caring for those who had been forgotten. And in that quiet moment by the fire, he realized that he was, at last, truly home. A life rebuilt. The winter months were harsh, with icy winds sweeping through the city and frost creeping across every surface. But for the first time in years, Dean and his dogs were safe and warm, sheltered from the unforgiving cold. The room at the community center, once just a simple offer of refuge, had become a true home. Dean had decorated the space with little mementos people had gifted him. A handmade sign that read family, a collection of framed photos Clara had taken of him and the dogs, and a few soft rugs that made the place feel cozy and welcoming. The community center staff had given Dean responsibilities as a sort of informal resident caretaker, helping with small tasks around the building in exchange for his stay. He took great pride in his work, sweeping floors, tidying up the common areas, and occasionally assisting at events hosted by the center. The work was simple, but it gave him a sense of purpose, a way to give back to the place and people who had given him so much. Each morning, Dean would wake up early, surrounded by the soft snores of his dogs. Scott, ever vigilant, would be curled up right beside him, his warm body a reassuring presence. Peanut usually ended up sprawled across Dean's legs, while Rusty, Bella, and the others claimed their own favorite spots around the room. They had each carved out a place in his life, and he in theirs. Together, they were a family. The kindness of the community continued to amaze him. Every day, new people stopped by to visit, to see the man and his dogs who had captured their hearts. Some brought gifts, others simply offered their friendship. He had built connections with people he never thought he'd know, each relationship a reminder that he was valued, that he mattered. One snowy afternoon, Clara arrived at the community center with a surprise. She had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, trying to find a way to secure Dean and his dogs a permanent place in the community. She knew that while the community center had offered him a temporary home, Dean needed something more lasting, a place he could truly call his own. "Dean," she began, her face lit up with excitement as she entered his room. "I have something to show you. Can you spare a few hours?" Dean looked at her, intrigued, and nodded. "Of course, Clara. You've always got something interesting up your sleeve," he replied with a warm chuckle. She led him and the dogs outside, where a van waited to take them to a location on the outskirts of the city. As they drove through the snow-covered streets, Clara kept the details of her plan a secret, only offering him reassuring smiles and promises that he would love what she had to show him. When they finally arrived, Dean looked out the window, eyes widening in surprise. They were parked in front of a modest, cozy-looking cabin nestled on a small plot of land surrounded by trees. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, and a light dusting of snow covered the roof. The place looked like something out of a winter postcard, warm and inviting against the backdrop of the cold, white landscape. Clara grinned, watching his reaction. "Dean, this is for you. The community pooled together enough money to secure this place for you and the dogs. It's yours, for as long as you want it." As he sat down on a fallen log, Scott trotted over, resting his head on Dean's knee, looking up at him with those wise, loyal eyes. Dean stroked his fur, feeling a swell of gratitude for the journey that had led him here, to this moment of quiet contentment. He opened his journal, and in his neat, careful handwriting, wrote, "There was a time when I thought I had nothing left. I was lost, drifting, unseen. But then, in the darkest moments, I found a family. I found love in the gentle eyes of a stray dog, in the kindness of strangers who refused to let me be forgotten. Today, I am no longer just surviving. I am living, truly living, surrounded by those who understand the beauty of compassion. This is my story, and it is one of resilience, of love, and of the undeniable strength we find when we open our hearts. I am Dean, the man who loves his dogs, the man who was given a second chance. As he closed the journal, Dean looked out at the peaceful woods, a smile spreading across his face. His life had been reborn, his purpose renewed, and he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was, at long last, home. Dean blinked, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. What? What do you mean? He stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. This can't be real. Clara took his hand, her eyes shining with pride and happiness. It's real, Dean. This place is yours. It's not just a shelter or a temporary solution. It's a home, your home. A place where you and the dogs can live without worrying about being moved or about having to leave. He stepped out of the van, feeling the crunch of snow under his boots as he gazed at the cabin. The dogs bounded out after him, their tails wagging as they sniffed around, curious and excited about the new surroundings. Scott trotted up to the front steps, his nose twitching as he explored this new world, while Peanut yapped happily, his small paws leaving tiny prints in the snow. Dean walked up to the cabin's front door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He pushed it open and stepped inside, the warmth of the room enveloping him like an embrace. The interior was simple but charming, with wooden floors, a cozy fireplace, and enough space for him and the dogs to live comfortably. There was even a small kitchen, stocked with basic supplies, and a bedroom with a large, comfortable bed, a luxury Dean hadn't experienced in years. As he took it all in, his eyes filled with tears. For so long, he had accepted that he would never have a place of his own again, that he would spend his days wandering, surviving on scraps and handouts. But now he had been given the ultimate gift, a home, a place where he could finally find peace and stability. Clara watched him with a gentle smile, giving him a moment to absorb everything. The community center will still be there if you ever need anything, and the shelter has offered to continue helping with supplies for the dogs. But now you'll have a place where you can settle down, where you can live without fear of the unknown. Dean turned to her, his face wet with tears. I don't know how to thank you, Clara. You've given me more than I ever thought possible. She stepped forward, wrapping him in a warm embrace. You've already done so much, Dean. You showed this community what it means to care, even when life gives you every reason not to. This is just our way of giving back to you. Over the next few days, Dean settled into his new home, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never known. The dogs adjusted quickly, each one claiming their own favorite spots in the cabin. Scott, as always, stayed close to Dean, sleeping at the foot of his bed every night. Bella found a cozy corner near the fireplace, where she would curl up in the evenings, her sleek coat gleaming in the firelight. Peanut, ever the explorer, took to sleeping on the sofa, his small body stretched out as though he owned the place. People continued to visit, bringing small housewarming gifts and sharing in his joy. They came not just to see Dean, but to be part of something they had all helped create. It was a community effort, a collective act of kindness that had transformed a man's life and reminded everyone of the power of compassion. One evening, as Dean sat by the fire, Clara came by for a visit, carrying a gift wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to him with a smile, urging him to open it. Inside, Dean found a beautiful leather-bound journal. Clara had written a note on the first page. For Dean, a man who taught us that love has no limits. May you fill these pages with new memories, with moments of joy and peace. Thank you for showing us that kindness is always worth the effort. Dean looked up at her, his heart full. Thank you, Clara. I don't know if I'll ever be able to put into words what all of this means to me. Clara smiled softly. Take your time. This is just the beginning. You have a whole new life ahead of you, a chance to rebuild, to make memories that are yours. In the months that followed, Dean did just that. He began writing in the journal, recording the days he spent with his dogs, the visits from friends, the quiet evenings by the fire. He wrote about the way Scott would nudge him awake every morning, the sound of Peanut's playful barks as he chased after falling leaves, the comforting crackle of the fire on cold nights. He also started volunteering at the community center, giving back to the place that had given him so much. He would bring the dogs along, sharing his story with others who were struggling, offering them a reminder that hope was never truly lost, that life could change in the most unexpected ways. One day, while walking through the nearby woods with his pack, Dean paused to take in the sight of his dogs running freely, their tails wagging, their faces full of pure joy. He realized that he was, at last, at peace. He had found his place, his purpose, surrounded by friends both old and new, in a world he had once thought had abandoned him.